Hello, everyone.
What are you doing? The words flew out of my mouth before I could even think. I wasn't trying to accuse him or anything, I was just shocked. John spun around, eyes wide with surprise, his hand gripping a half-empty glass of red wine. The dim light in the room cast shadows across his face, making him look older, more vulnerable somehow. For a split second, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, caught off guard, as if I'd interrupted something I wasn't supposed to see. Sorry. I didn't hear you come in, he muttered, setting the glass down with an awkward clink. But his voice gave him away. It was low, tense, like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't have. I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorway, studying him carefully. John wasn't the kind of guy who got rattled easily. He was always composed, always in control. Yet here he was, looking unsettled. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Before that night, John had always been just John, my stepmom's husband, nothing more. We never talked much. Sure, we exchanged polite greetings, but that was it. He wasn't exactly warm, and I wasn't looking for any kind of connection. But now? Now something was different, and it made my skin tingle in a way I didn't understand. You okay? I asked, trying to sound casual, though my heart was racing. He looked at me again, but this time his eyes lingered a little too long, as if he was searching for something, maybe reassurance, maybe permission. I couldn't tell. I've had a rough day, he said finally, his voice softer, almost defeated. It was strange hearing him like that. Vulnerable. For a moment, I considered walking away, ending this awkward moment before it turned into something more complicated. But instead, I stayed. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something else entirely, something I wasn't ready to admit even to myself. You want to talk about it? The words came out before I could stop them, and as soon as they did, I regretted it. What was I thinking? This was my stepmom's husband. I shouldn't be offering to play therapist. But John didn't laugh it off or brush me aside. He didn't make an excuse to leave. Instead, he looked at me with an intensity that made my stomach flip. Maybe, yeah, he said slowly, as if weighing each word carefully. If you don't mind. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't prepared for this. But something in his eyes kept me rooted in place. So I nodded, motioning for him to sit down on the couch. As he did, I couldn't help but notice how tired he looked, how the weight of whatever he was carrying seemed to press down on his shoulders. I sat across from him, trying to ignore the strange tension filling the room. So, what's going on? John sighed deeply, rubbing the back of his neck. It's complicated. He paused, glancing at me as if deciding whether to continue. You ever feel like you're just lost? Like you don't really know where you're headed, and nothing feels right anymore? His question caught me off guard. This wasn't the kind of conversation I'd expected. It was deeper, more personal. And for some reason, it made my chest tighten. Yeah, sometimes, I admitted, surprised by my own honesty. I guess everyone feels that way now and then. He nodded slowly, but there was something in his expression, something heavy, like he wasn't just talking about a bad day at work. This was something bigger. More serious. I don't know, he said after a long silence. It's like everything's falling apart, and I don't know how to stop it. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? I wasn't exactly an expert on life or relationships. Hell, I could barely figure out my own problems. But there was something in the way he looked at me that made me want to help, even if I didn't know how. You're not alone, you know, I said quietly. Everyone goes through stuff like this. He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. Thanks, he said. I don't know why I'm even telling you this. I guess I just needed someone to listen. And just like that, the dynamic between us shifted. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, but it was there, an unspoken connection, something fragile and uncertain, but undeniably real. I felt it in the way he looked at me, in the way his voice softened when he spoke. As the conversation drifted on, the awkwardness began to fade. We talked about everything and nothing, work, life, the little things that didn't seem to matter but somehow did. And with each passing minute, the tension between us grew. Not the bad kind of tension, but something different. Something charged. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that I was imagining things. But it was there, lingering in the air like static before a storm. And deep down, I knew this wasn't just a casual chat between two people. This was something more. Something dangerous. When the clock struck midnight, I realized how late it had gotten. I should probably head to bed, I said, standing up. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Yeah, good idea, John agreed, though he didn't move right away. He just sat there, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Good night, I said, turning toward the hallway. Good night, he echoed, his voice low and thoughtful. As I climbed the stairs, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. He was still sitting there, staring at the empty space where I'd been. And for a brief moment, I wondered what might have happened if I'd stayed just a little longer. But I shook the thought away. This was crazy. He was my stepmom's husband. Whatever was happening between us, it couldn't go any further. It just couldn't. Yet as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning. And whatever came next, it was going to get a whole lot more complicated. I looked at John carefully, trying to gauge what exactly he wanted to talk about. There was something in his expression, an uneasy mix of weariness and vulnerability, that made me feel both anxious and curious at the same time. Sure, I said with a nod, trying to appear calm and indifferent, even though my mind was already spinning. He gestured toward the couch, and once I settled into the cushions, he sat across from me, his body language tense, his gaze distant. It's hard to explain, he began, his eyes fixed on the floor. His voice was low, quiet, like he was carrying a weight too heavy to bear. But lately, I felt lost. Like I don't know who I am anymore. He paused, exhaling slowly, and I could see how much effort it took for him to say those words. Cindy's busy with her own life, and me. I feel like I'm just a shadow in the background. His confession caught me off guard. On the surface, everything about John and Cindy's relationship seemed fine, stable, even happy. But now, hearing this, I realized that appearances could be deceiving. There was more going on beneath the surface than I'd ever imagined. My first instinct was to offer him some kind of encouragement, to tell him that things would get better. But something about the way he looked at me stopped me. This wasn't just a casual venting session, it felt too personal, too raw. He held my gaze, and for a moment, it felt like he was silently asking for something more than just empty words. I get it, I said finally, my voice soft but steady. Sometimes, it's easier to pretend everything's fine than to admit that you're struggling. He gave a faint, almost sad smile. Yeah. But pretending only gets you so far, right? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together tightly. I don't know why I'm even telling you this. I guess I just needed someone to listen. Something in his tone struck a chord deep inside me. He wasn't asking for advice. He wasn't looking for answers. He just needed someone to be there, to understand. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I wanted to be that person for him, even if it meant stepping into dangerous territory. You're not alone, you know, I said quietly, my eyes meeting his. Everyone feels lost sometimes. It doesn't mean you're broken, it just means you're human. He looked at me with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. For a few seconds, either of us said a word. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was charged, like the air before a storm. Thanks, he murmured eventually, his voice barely more than a whisper. It means a lot. I nodded, unsure what else to say. My emotions were a tangled mess, part sympathy, part something else I didn't want to name. This was John, my stepmom's husband. Whatever was happening here, I knew it wasn't right. But despite that, I didn't pull away. I couldn't. As the minutes ticked by, the conversation shifted. We started talking about lighter things, work, hobbies, anything to break the tension. But even as we spoke, the weight of what had been said lingered in the air. I could feel it in the way his eyes occasionally flicked toward me, in the way my pulse quickened every time our gazes met. At one point, I noticed how close we were sitting. When had that happened? The space between us felt too small, too intimate. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the words we were exchanging, but it was impossible. The tension was growing, thickening, wrapping around us like an invisible thread, pulling us closer together. I should probably go, I said suddenly, breaking the spell. I stood up quickly, needing to put some distance between us. It's getting late. Yeah, you're right, John agreed, though he didn't move right away. He just sat there, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. I turned toward the hallway, but before I could take a step, he spoke again. Hey, thanks for listening. I mean it. I glanced back at him, offering a small smile. Anytime. As I walked away, I felt his eyes on me, and for a brief moment, I considered turning around. But I didn't. Instead, I kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached my room, I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, exhaling shakily. My mind was racing, replaying every moment of our conversation. I didn't understand why I felt this way, why being around John made my heart race and my thoughts scatter. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was married to Cindy. He was off limits. And yet, something about the way he looked at me, the way he opened up to me, made it impossible to ignore the pull between us. I lay down on my bed, staring at the ceiling. The logical part of me knew I needed to stay away from him, to put some distance between us before things got out of hand. But another part, the part one didn't want to acknowledge, was already looking forward to the next time we'd be alone. And that terrified me. Because deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. And whatever happened next, it wasn't going to be simple. It wasn't going to be easy. It was going to be messy. Complicated. Dangerous. And I wasn't sure I was strong enough to walk away. After that night, I couldn't get John out of my head. His words lingered, leaving behind a trail of thoughts I didn't want to have. It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he looked at me, the way the air felt thick with unspoken emotions every time we were in the same room. Over the next few days, we kept our distance, but that didn't make things any easier. Silence can be louder than words, and in our case, it was deafening. Each glance we exchanged seemed to say the same thing, I remember. Cindy didn't notice a thing. She was too wrapped up in her work to sense the tension hanging between us. And maybe that was part of the problem. It felt like John and I were living in a separate world, one where unspoken feelings simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to boil over. One evening, I came home later than usual. The house was quiet, except for the faint sound of sizzling from the kitchen. Cindy was still at work, and John was at the stove, cooking something that smelled surprisingly good. I hadn't planned on interacting with him. I just wanted to grab a snack and retreat to my room. But as I passed by the kitchen, he turned and caught my eye. Want something to drink? His voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, something that made me pause. I hesitated for a moment, torn between the safe choice of walking away and the dangerous allure of staying. Sure, why not? I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. John pulled 2 wine glasses from the cabinet and poured us each a generous amount. I took the glass he offered and sat down at the small kitchen table. The silence that followed wasn't exactly uncomfortable, but it was charged, like we were both waiting for the other to make the first move. We drank quietly, the clinking of glasses the only sound between us. The tension was palpable, like a taut string ready to snap at any moment. Just as I was about to break the silence with some meaningless small talk, John spoke. You were right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes you just need someone who'll listen. I looked up at him, caught off guard by the sudden vulnerability in his tone. There was something different in his eyes tonight, not just sadness, but a longing to be understood. And the way he looked at me made my heart race in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. Everyone needs that, I said softly, unsure of what else to say. He gave a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. Yeah, but it's harder than it sounds. Most people don't really listen. They just wait for their turn to talk. There was something about the way he said it, the quiet bitterness in his voice, that made me feel a pang of sympathy. I knew I should have stopped right there, made an excuse, and walked away. But instead, I stayed. I'm glad you felt like you could talk to me, I said, and as soon as the words left my mouth, I realized how much I meant them. Despite the awkwardness, despite the lines we were dangerously close to crossing, part of me was glad he trusted me. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he took another sip of wine, his gaze fixed on the countertop as if lost in thought. When he finally spoke, his voice was even softer than before. It's strange, isn't it? How you can live with someone, share your life with them, and still feel so alone. There it was again, that crack in his composure, the glimpse of the man beneath the surface. And it terrified me, not because of what he was saying, but because of how it made me feel. I shouldn't have cared this much. I shouldn't have felt this pull toward him. But I did. I reached for my glass, taking a long sip to buy myself time. I guess, sometimes the people closest to us aren't the ones who really see us. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world faded away. You see me, he said quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew that if I didn't end this now, things would spiral out of control. But instead of walking away, I found myself leaning forward, closing the distance between us. John, I started, but I didn't know how to finish. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was brief, barely more than a graze, but it sent a jolt through me. You don't have to say anything, he whispered. I don't want to feel alone anymore. In that moment, I knew I had a choice. I could pull back, set a boundary, and walk away. Or I could stay, cross that invisible line, and see where it led. Every instinct screamed at me to choose the first option, to keep things simple and safe. But there was a part of me, reckless, curious, and maybe a little desperate, that didn't want to walk away. And before I could think it through, before I could stop myself, I made my choice. I stayed. With each passing day, the tension between John and me grew thicker, heavier, almost unbearable. We tried to keep our distance, but it was like playing a game where both of us knew the rules yet refused to admit we were playing. Every glance we exchanged, every brief interaction, felt charged with something unsaid. Something that neither of us dared to acknowledge aloud. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I was reading too much into things, letting my mind wander where it shouldn't. But it was there, real, undeniable. The way his eyes lingered on me a second longer than they should, the way my pulse quickened whenever I heard his footsteps approaching. Whatever this was, it was growing, and it was only a matter of time before it spilled over. That evening, Cindy was once again working late. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards as John moved around. I sat in the living room with a book open on my lap, though I wasn't really reading. My thoughts kept drifting back to him. I could hear him in the kitchen, the sound of cupboards opening and closing, and with each passing minute, the tension inside me tightened like a coil ready to snap. Finally, I heard his footsteps drawing closer. I didn't look up, pretending to be engrossed in my book. But when he stopped at the doorway, I couldn't ignore him any longer. Can we talk? He asked, his voice hesitant but firm. I closed the book slowly, my fingers trembling slightly as I placed it on the table beside me. Sure, I said, keeping my voice as neutral as possible, though my heart was already racing. He walked over and sat down beside me, not too close, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Neither of us seemed to know how to start, how to say what we both knew was coming. "You feel it too, don't you?" John finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet but steady, his gaze locked on mine. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. What was I supposed to say? That yes, I felt it too? That every time I saw him, I felt this strange pull, this dangerous mix of curiosity and desire? Admitting it felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure we could ever come back from. I started, but my voice faltered. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching mine for some kind of answer. "We can't ignore it," he said softly. "Not anymore." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. This was the moment, the point of no return. I could walk away now, pretend this conversation never happened, and keep things from spiraling out of control. Or I could stay, face whatever this was head on, and see where it led. "John," I said quietly, forcing myself to meet his gaze. This isn't right." "I know," he admitted, his voice filled with a mix of regret and something else, something I didn't want to name. "But it doesn't change how I feel." There it was. The truth laid bare between us. He wasn't asking for permission or forgiveness. He was simply telling me what I already knew deep down. And as much as I wanted to deny it, to tell him that we could never go down this path, I couldn't bring myself to say the words. "I don't know what to do," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Neither do I," he said, a faint, bittersweet smile playing on his lips. "But I know I don't want to keep pretending this isn't real." I looked away, unable to hold his gaze any longer. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, guilt, longing. This was wrong. It had to be. But if that was true, then why did it feel so inevitable? Before I could overthink it any further, John reached out, his hand gently brushing against mine. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, like a spark igniting something deep inside. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped this before it went any further. But instead, I stayed still, letting the moment linger. "I don't want to hurt anyone," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Neither do I," he replied. "But sometimes, you can't control what you feel." The truth of his words hit me hard. We were standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could shatter everything if we let it. And yet, despite the fear, despite the risk, I didn't want to walk away. "I need time to think," I said finally, pulling my hand back gently. It's too much." John nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. "Take all the time you need," he said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." With that, he stood up and left the room, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. I sat there for what felt like hours, replaying the conversation over and over in my mind. Every word, every glance, every touch, it was all burned into my memory, impossible to forget. I knew this wasn't over. Whatever was happening between us, it was far from finished. This was just the beginning, and deep down, I knew that the next time we were alone, things would only escalate further. As I finally stood up and headed to my room, one thought echoed in my mind. What happens next could change everything. And somehow, I couldn't decide if that terrified me or thrilled me. I didn't know what exactly pushed me to take the next step. Was it the tension that had been building for days, the spark of desire I couldn't ignore, or the sheer inability to hold back any longer? "We really can't keep pretending," I whispered, my voice barely audible, like a confession I couldn't take back. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, until John leaned in, closing the distance. His hand reached up, gently brushing against my cheek, and I closed my eyes, surrendering to the inevitable. There were no more words, no hesitation. This was it, the moment we both knew was coming, but never dared to acknowledge. His touch was soft, careful, yet charged with a heat that made my breath catch. Everything about this felt dangerous, forbidden, and completely impossible to resist. I don't know how long we stayed like that, lost in each other, but when it was over, the weight of what had just happened hit me hard. Lying next to him, my mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: guilt, regret, desire. Part of me wanted to take it all back, to pretend it never happened. But another part wanted it to happen again. As I struggled to make sense of it all, the door suddenly swung open, and my heart stopped. There she was, Cindy, standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at us, as if trying to process the scene in front of her. And then, in a voice that was cold but trembling with emotion, she asked, "What's going on here?" Panic surged through me. I jumped up, fumbling for anything, to say, but no words came out. John remained silent, his expression unreadable, though I could see the tension in his jaw. He knew, just as I did, that there was no way to explain this. No way to undo what had already been done. Cindy didn't wait for an answer. She turned on her heel and walked away, the sound of the doors slamming behind her echoing through the house. For the rest of the night, neither of us spoke. The silence was unbearable, filled with everything we couldn't say. I felt trapped between wanting to run after Cindy and knowing it wouldn't change anything. She had seen enough. She knew. The next morning, she was gone. No note, no goodbye, just an empty space where her things used to be. John sat at the kitchen table, staring at his coffee as if it held the answers to everything. I stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do or say. "Do you think she'll come back?" I asked quietly, breaking the silence. "I don't know," he replied, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. The reality of what we had done started sinking in. This wasn't just a mistake we could sweep under the rug. It was a fracture, a break in the fragile balance of our lives that couldn't be repaired. And yet, despite the guilt gnawing at me, I couldn't bring myself to fully regret it. Days passed, and life moved on, but things were far from normal. Cindy didn't return, and though John and I tried to act as if nothing had changed, the truth hung between us like a dark cloud. I could feel his eyes on me whenever we were in the same room, and each glance was a reminder of that night, of the line we had crossed, and the chaos we had unleashed. One evening, as we sat in silence once again, I finally broke. "I can't do this, John. I can't keep pretending everything's fine." He looked at me, his expression tired, worn down by the weight of it all. "I know," he admitted. "But what do we do now?" That was the question, wasn't it? What could we do? We couldn't take it back. We couldn't erase what had happened. All we could do was move forward, but how? How do you move forward when you've destroyed something that was never meant to be broken? "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I don't want to be the reason everything falls apart." "You're not," he said firmly. "We both made a choice. It wasn't just you." His words were meant to comfort me, but they didn't. If anything, they made me feel worse. Because deep down, I knew that no matter how much we tried to justify it, we had hurt someone who didn't deserve it. And that wasn't something either of us could fix. As the days turned into weeks, the silence between us grew heavier. Cindy hadn't contacted John, and he didn't try to reach out to her. It was like we were both waiting, for what, I didn't know. Maybe for her to return, maybe for things to somehow go back to the way they were. But deep down, I knew that was impossible. One night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized something. No matter what happened next, things would never be the same. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And whether Cindy came back or not, we would have to live with the consequences of that night for the rest of our lives. And maybe that was the real punishment. Not losing Cindy, but losing the illusion that we could ever be the people we were before. And that's how it ended. Or did it? Maybe Cindy would come back. Maybe she'd forgive John. Maybe she wouldn't. Maybe things would get even more complicated from here. I don't know. What do you think? Let me know in the comments, what would you do if you were Cindy? Would you forgive, or would you walk away forever?
Bye.